On Undistracted, it is an absolute pleasure to have Luke Mathers, the author of a brand new book. It's called Curious Habits, Why We Do What We Do and How to Change. Luke, thank you so much for your time today.
It's great to be here. Good to have a chat.
Curiosity and habits, an interesting combination that you've pulled together there. What is a curious habit, and why do you feel like curiosity is part of the way we look at them?
Yeah, I get that asked that one all the time. And I think what a curious habit is something you do think or feel where your default is no longer serving you. So every habit we have a reason for every habit. It starts off for a reason. The hassle is that usually because we get something out of it. And the hassle is that a lot of the times the reward can come out of it, but we still do the habit. We're not getting the good stuff anymore, but we're going to still do it because of the pathways in our brain have just gone that way. And so we end up doing these things that aren't serving us anymore. And I think the only way to stop that is to get curious.
And curiosity is something I think some of us have innately. We were that 3-year-old that kept just asking why and how and all of these questions. But as we get older, it's not necessarily a quality that's present for everyone. So how do you build curiosity and that question of why as an adult?
Yeah, I don't even, I think the way you said it then is we all had that 3-year-old. We were all 3-year-olds and we all had curiosity. We've just had it beaten out of us somehow. And so we've had it there. It's in us. It's in us still. We've just got to go looking for it. And I think that's one of the things that we haven't done. We've sort of got stuck in whatever sort of thing we do. And that's just how we stay. And I think we've got to start getting curious and sort of working out, what am I getting out of some of the things that I'm doing, and how can I change that? Because I want to change it, not because I have to. And I think that's a really big distinction.
That distinction then, why is that so important? The want versus have to.
Well, one of the problems is that humans, there's a few things that go on in our brains. One is that we have a negative bias. I think we all know about that. And that kind of makes sense. If you're a caveman and you don't notice the bad stuff around, you got eaten, all right? So the ones that did notice the bad stuff and were a little bit anxious and were on edge, they're the ones that actually pass their genes down to us. You know, I live in a place called Lukeland where unicorns fart rainbows and everyone's nice and everyone's really good. And in Lukeland, if I was in the jungle 10,000 years ago, I would have got eaten. I would have been sitting there off with the fairies thinking about something lovely and, staring at rainbows. And a tiger would have come and eaten me. I wouldn't have been looking around for that. So we've got this stuff in us. We've got this negative bias. And so we think about the negative things quite a lot. But I think we've also got to get curious about what other options there are out there.
And start to see a little bit of optimism, maybe. Like it's not totally bad, I suppose, to have that optimism, but then I guess you've got to have it grounded in some sense of practicality. How do we take things that may look negative and get them into something that's a little bit more positive and fruitful, perhaps?
Yeah. So one of the things about it is we might, one of the chapters in the book is about negative self-talk. We do seem to talk to ourselves in ways that we'd never talk to anyone else, and we wouldn't allow someone to talk to us that way. That's a curious habit. Why would we do that?
Yeah.
And one of the things is because we have that negative bias, the negative thing might happen, but at least we were right about the negative thing happening. You know what I mean? And I think that's a really curious habit, to be right about something we didn't want to happen.
Yeah.
And,
Sorry, go ahead.
One of the examples I use is, the other day I was going to reverse park my car, right? And it was a really, really tight spot, and I didn't think I could quite get it in because my car's quite long. And as I was going to do it, I'm thinking, I'm not going to get in here. And when I didn't get in here, I'm going, shit, I told you I wasn't going to get in here, and off I drove. Where if I probably went into that with a more positive mindset, I probably would have concentrated a little bit better on actually getting it done rather than sort of kicking stones that I didn't do it.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
You're going to have all these ambitious people with big utes trying to fit in these tiny little spots now. It's great.
Yeah, well, I haven't got a big ute, but I know what you're saying.
And I think it's something that your book really brings up to us is that idea of evaluating the way we structure our life and the outcomes of it. If you've arrived at that point where you think something is not working for me, what is the process that you sort of begin from there? What would be the first step to kicking off this kind of process of analysis about what habits you've got and how they're serving you?
Yeah, great question. The first one's get curious. We've got to have a look and sort of see what am I getting out of doing this, and what am I trying to get? One of the stories I talk about in the book is I used to be a very large human. I was at 100 and I got up to near 120 kilos. I'm 6'3", so I'm a tall dude.
Hmm.
I'm now about 93, and I was an optometrist for a lot of years. I was one of the original directors of Specsavers in Australia. So when they came, we went around the country and signed people up to be part of Specsavers. We kind of think of Specsavers as being here forever, but 15 years ago, we'd never heard of it. And one of the things about it is I've asked which one's clearer, number one or number two, 1,000 times. I've actually asked it 6.5 million times. I did the maths. All right. And towards the end of the day, towards the end of my career as an optometrist, I would get kind of agitated. I'd feel a little bit frustrated and a little bit antsy just because I'm fucking sick of doing this. All right. And my way of fixing that was I would go to the shop that was the supermarket that was in our shopping center, and I'd buy Pepsi Max and chocolate chip cookies. All right. And I'd buy enough chocolate chip cookies to share with my team and all of that sort of stuff. And I'd eat way more than I said I was going to eat. And my way of dealing with the anxiety of feeling anxious, of frustrated, was to eat chocolate chip cookies and Pepsi Max. So I'm feeling anxiety. Let's throw sugar and caffeine on that and see how that goes. You know what I mean? It's a really curious habit. It's not going to help. So what I was feeling was I was feeling anxious. What I wanted to feel was feel calm and connected and be able to talk to the next person, enjoy the next person I was going to see. Chocolate chip cookies and Pepsi Max weren't getting me that. They were giving me that instant hit of this tastes good. I'm doing something that feels good in the moment, but I was still feeling anxious. I was still feeling I don't want to be here. So what's another thing? And we kind of look at triggers in our life and we sort of, this happens, so I do whatever my default habit is. And, if you have a gun and you pull the trigger on a gun, you don't have any control over that bullet then. It's gone. All right. I think we got to start using those sorts of cues, those sort of feelings as cues to get curious. And so now what happens is when I feel that knot in my stomach, I use that as my cue to get curious. And what am I thinking? Why am I thinking it? Is it helping? And then I do a thing called a reset, which is Control Alt Delete. What can I control? What are my alternatives? And what should I get rid of?
Wow.
I realized the Pepsi Max and the chocolate chip cookies weren't helping. So what are my alternatives? And what I would do then is I'd sit in my consulting room chair and I'd just breathe into my stomach for a couple of minutes. And that got me the calmness I wanted. That got me present with the people I was talking to next. And that actually made me a better optometrist. All right. And I actually enjoyed it more because I was present. And you talk about indistractable. Being present is such a superpower for any walk of life. And I wasn't getting that from sugar and caffeine, but I certainly got that from getting my system to calm down and getting my biology under control. And then I was able to connect with whoever I was seeing next.
Right. And there's just such a powerful mentality shift in there, I think, of going from these habits that weren't serving you to then having that internal dialogue of, hang on a minute, something's not working, what's not working, and then making a change. And that process, I think, is something a lot of people struggle with, getting their mind to change and make positive new choices. How did you do that? How do we do that to not just realize there's a problem, but actually have that 15 seconds of willpower that you talk about in your book where we make a difference?
Yeah. So what happens with that is that there's a thing called reward invariance. And reward invariance is basically, it's big words for basically saying I'm not getting anything out of this thing that I'm doing. All right. And that's the thing that we've got to catch ourselves. What things are we doing? Caffeine and sugar weren't a good option for this. So what is a good option? And I think that's what we've got to look at. What do I want to get out of it? What am I getting out of now? I think there's a sort of 3-step process. The first one's awareness. The second one is sort of disillusionment. I'm not getting what I want out of this, and then start looking for alternatives. And the third one is repeat the new habit that you've had and take notice of the fact that it actually works and I feel better and this is good. Wow, this is a thing I'd rather do. I'd rather do 2 minutes of belly breathing and get my biology under control than eat sugar and caffeine. All right. And what happened then is it wasn't like, oh, I'm not allowed to drink Pepsi and I'm not allowed to eat chocolate chip cookies. It was, well, I'm not getting anything out of that. That's not serving me. My pants don't fit anymore and I'm getting acid in my stomach. What can I do that will actually make me calm and enjoy my day at work and go home with some energy still left in my bucket?
Mm,
And if I do that from a place of scarcity and lack, I shouldn't eat caffeine and I shouldn't have sugar. We're always pushing it uphill. But if we do it because we want to do it, then we don't. I love the
mm.
story of Sisyphus. I don't know if you know the story of Sisyphus in ancient Greece, but he was condemned. He was condemned for all of eternity by the gods of ancient Greece, and the worst possible punishment they could come up with was he had to push a rock up, massive big boulder up a hill every single day, only for it to roll back down at the end of the day.
Mm.
And I think that's kind of how we're looking at habit change. I do workshops in companies and stuff to sort of teach them how to reset better and how to concentrate and how to get better culture. And this is actually the front of one of our worksheets, and it's got sort of bang head here. And I think that's the way we look at stress reduction and habit change. We're just going to keep banging our head against the wall at looking at the old ways that we've done stuff and not change them, and change them because we want to, not because we have to.
Mm. It's interesting that you celebrate disillusionment because that's something that, I mean, in personal experiences, that's this moment where you just kind of go, whoa, like everything just hits you because this aspiration or this optimism that you had is just confronted with the reality of a circumstance that's so outside of your control. And you do feel disillusioned, disenchanted, however you want to look at that.
Mhm.
How does disillusionment serve us when it is something that can be so painful for a time?
Yeah, so I love the way you said that because disillusion, disenchantment, whichever one you want to use, if that becomes your cue to look for alternatives, then you can actually find alternatives that you really want to do. I really want to do this. Every time I do this, it feels great. And that's the other one to actually, probably the godfather of modern behavior change is a professor from Stanford called BJ Fogg. And BJ Fogg has a thing he calls sunshine. And I love this. And it's basically when I do the new habit that I really want to instill, just notice it. Just stop for a second and say, yeah, that feels good. Like when I did my 2 minutes of belly breathing, I would just sit there and go, oh, I feel great now. That feels awesome. And what that does, it tells your brain this is really good. Let's do it again.
Mm.
One of the stars of the show in Curious Habits is a thing called a sea squirt, and it pops up all the way through. And
Yes,
you're nodding. Yeah, you've obviously read the
the
book,
cute
so
little
you
sea
can.
squirt, man.
Man, we've all got this little sea squirt in our head. And a sea squirt is basically this tiny little lava that swims around the ocean and it goes towards the places where the water's nice and clean and lots of nutrients. And it goes away from where there's toxins. It goes towards a good thing, away from bad thing. Makes sense. We've all got one of those inside our brains. And what it does is once it finds a good spot, it attaches to a sea floor and it actually eats its own brain. Decides I'm not going to move anymore. I don't need a brain. I can get rid of that. I told that story to a group of executives at a local council, and they said, "Oh, we've got whole departments of sea squirts here. They're everywhere." And I love that idea. That idea of the sea squirts. If I don't need to change, I don't need to use my brain. And I think that's
Mm.
kind of what we do with our habits. We kind of get our habits, and that's just how I stay. That's my identity. And I think we can change it. I think we have the ability to change it, and I think curiosity is the superpower to do that. But we've got to
Mm.
look at what we're doing, what we're getting out of what we're doing, and what the alternatives are, and make that a desirable thing that we want to do.
Mm. Yeah, the sea squirt really is a hero of the story, and it is fascinating the way that it's just such a picture of how our thinking and our ability to make choices, analyze situations affects the direction we go in life. Like there's a certain intentionality as part of this process, and for many of us, we wish we didn't have our brain because then we wouldn't self-sabotage. We wouldn't have that part of us that can undermine all of the different changes that we are trying to make. That aspect of our human condition, where we do make positive steps and then do something to totally, derail it. Is
Yeah.
there a way from your perspective that we can become better at overcoming that self-sabotaging aspect of ourselves?
It really is a thing, isn't it? Self-sabotage. It's yeah, it massively is a thing. One of the things, and it goes a little bit back to that self-talk. I love the idea of having an alter ego. I have an alter ego. His name is Carlos, and he's an amazing man. Luke's a little bit lazy. Luke's a little bit distracted. Luke has a thing called shiny squirrel syndrome. I actually have a shiny squirrel in my office, and it's basically that thing of I get distracted more easily than I want to. Carlos doesn't. Carlos actually stays present. And one of the things I do in my coaching and also in the workshops when I run with companies around the place is we do a thing called Finding Carlos, and it's coming up with the characteristics of you at your best. And it's a whole process. You can actually download it on my website if you want to. And it's a process of finding out what your aspirational goals are. Who do I want to be? All right. And funnily enough, talking on this podcast about, getting distracted and things like that. Mine used to be I was curious, creative, and generous. So the best version of me was curious, creative, and generous. And if I turned up as curious, creative, and generous, I was happy as a pig in poo. Right. And what I worked out is I kind of have most of those three. I kind of do those three almost, instinctively. And one of the things we want to do with these aspirational goals is you want to have at least one that's something I'm working on. And so I've changed mine now. And and what I've done is I've taken generous out. It's not that I don't want to be generous. I'm going to be generous, but I don't have to work at it. And what my goals now are is I'm curious, creative, and present. So if I'm talking to you, Laura, I'm 100% talking to you. I'm not looking at something over there. I'm not checking my phone. I'm not looking at Instagram. I'm talking to you. All right. And since I've changed my sort of trademark traits, the things I want to be, and I've changed it to being curious, creative, and present, I've actually been more present. It's a really, really cool thing. But one of the hassles is we don't actually stop and say, what do we want to be? We'll do things like Myers-Briggs or disc profiles or horoscopes or whatever. I'm a Sagittarius, so I do this. I think some of them are useful until they're not. All right. But if we can actually get really clear on who we want to be and what the best version of us turns up like, I actually reckon we can connect with that person. And we use an alter ego to do that. What would Carlos do is a question I ask all the time. So there's a little thing I can get there that what would Carlos do? All right. And whenever I ask what would Carlos do, the smart part of my brain and the emotional part of my brain link and talk to each other, and I give myself better advice.
And Carlos looks like he gets stuff done. So you fit
Carlos is awesome.
There's a question in this that I think, some of our listeners may come up with, because for the majority of us, we're listening to these kind of conversations because we want to do these processes of analysis. We want our lives to be intentional. We want to get to these goals that we have set for us. But I think within that, there is this question of, why do we want our lives to be something that has impact, something that goes intentionally in a certain direction? For you personally, what is it that makes you desire to think about your life with a little bit more of an intentionality, to use that word again, I suppose? Why do you care so much about doing these sorts of things?
Yeah, we can go down rabbit holes of existential angst and things like that if we want to. But I think my inner sea squirt just loves helping people see another way. I get a real buzz. I did a conference yesterday for a group of pharmacists. They've had a tough gig. They've had to go through COVID. They've had their staff getting sick. They've had people being cranky. That real fear at the start of COVID. Being a pharmacist for the last 2 years has been really tough. And I had like 300 in a room talking to them about some of this stuff yesterday. And you come out of that and then you meet some of these people afterwards, and you've given them some tools on how to actually deal with stress and how to actually look at things differently and how to change the things they need to. And, I call it like pissing in a wetsuit. If you've ever been surfing on a cold winter's morning and having a wee in a wetsuit just gives you a warm, fuzzy feeling all over. For non-surfers, that sounds disgusting. For surfers, it's okay. But
still gross.
It gives you that warm, fuzzy feeling. And I love helping people like that. And Carlos loves that too. And so the inner sea squirt in me said, that's good. Let's do that again. And so, I'll wake up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. I can't wait to go down and get curious about things, get creative about how to share some of this stuff and, be present with what I'm doing because I've really connected with that's who I want to be.
Obviously really resonates with you. And I think there'll be people listening who almost eliminate themselves from these kind of conversations because maybe they don't feel like they've got the ability to direct their attention in a productive way. I mean, I noticed on your wall there, you're talking about ADHD. For people who feel like their attention is scattered, where do they fit in this dialogue?
It's there's a rabbit hole we could spend hours wandering down, I think. But ADHD is one of those. There's a couple of things that I think we're confusing traits and states. And I'll just explain that. I think both anxiety and ADHD are things that we look at, and possibly even depression to a certain degree as well. And separating anxiety and depression is a really difficult thing these days. But I think we're very quick to turn them into a trait. Hi, my name's Luke. I've got brown eyes and I have anxiety. Rather than, if you hadn't eaten for, 15 hours, you'd be hungry. That wouldn't make you a hungry person, right? I'm feeling anxious. That doesn't make me an anxious person. And I think anxiety is a state. I'm feeling anxious at the moment. And I think we've turned it into a trait. I am an anxious person. And I actually think we've done that a little bit with concentration and attention, that we've turned it into, I'm struggling to concentrate, so I have ADHD. And I think there's a way that we've probably, our environment's set up to, there's things coming at us all the time. And we've constantly been bombarded by phones. Phones are huge, and we could probably have a whole podcast just on things to do with your phones.
Yeah.
But we've constantly got all these distractions coming at us. So they're coming at us all the time. And then we're saying, oh, now I've got this trait, I've got ADHD. And some people do. 5 or 10% of the people population have ADHD, and they really, really benefit from medication. Medication's fantastic for ADHD. But I think it should be something that we use along with things like environment, setting up our environment so that it helps. We've got to use awareness of what things are actually causing distraction and how can I change my environment so that's a bit easier. What are some systems we've got in place that actually keep me focused when I want to? And to sort of come up with that identity of this is who I want to be. And, if we put them together, it kind of spells easy. And it's not easy, but it's something that's definitely worth the effort.
So how do you define ADHD there?
I've got it on the board. I've sort of jigged the word, because one of the things about ADHD is that you don't have that attention deficit part. I really push back on that, because anyone who really does have ADHD, if they get into something, if they're right into it, they can concentrate their ass off. They're amazing how well they can concentrate. So calling it an attention deficit, I don't think is right. Right. The hyperactivity part, some people have that part, some people don't. But they don't necessarily have the attention deficit. They just aren't interested in the shit that people are trying to make them interested in. And that's why the attention gets diverted. So the kind of, I've rephrased it in terms of, attention diverted and happily distracted. And I think that's a lot of people have that sort of ADHD, I think, that our attention's getting diverted a lot and we're happily distracted, that something's feeling uncomfortable, I'm going to grab my phone and check Instagram. All right.
Yeah.
That's another one that's not going to help, but I'm going to do it anyway. The reward invariance of that, most of the time, all we're going to do is check Instagram and compare and despair the fact that other people are richer, better looking, have bigger boobs, better abs, whatever the hell that is. And just makes it feel worse, but I'm going to do it anyway. That's a curious habit.
And comparison is something that's really hard to get away from.
Oh, it's impossible. We can't not do it. We all do it. It's an old brain. It's ingrained with us. Dogs do it. Monkeys do it. It's all primates do it. We compare and despair. And I think I look at it, I check your privilege and, all of that sort of stuff. But I'm a 50-year-old Australian male who's, reasonably well off and all of that sort of stuff. And as a kid, you could kind of see the next run up the ladder. You had a friend that had a slightly bigger house than you. He might have had a better push bike than you when you were a kid. And, his dad had a better car than your dad's did. You can kind of see the next run up the ladder. The hassle is now every kid from about the age of 10 years old is walking around with the entire ladder in their pocket. They're looking at it incessantly. And one of the quirks of human nature is we only compare up. We don't compare down very often. All right. So what we're doing is we're looking at the entire ladder and we're at the bottom of it and wondering why we're starting to, particularly young teenagers and stuff, and why they're feeling shit about themselves. And it kind of makes sense that we're comparing and despairing both ways. One of the chapters in the book, I talk about the gap and the gain, which is a really cool concept by Dan Sullivan.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring this up. I wanted to talk about this, that idea of just like, I'll be happy when.
Yeah, we do it, don't we? We do it all the time. And I've done it myself. I left a really, really good business and went out to start speaking and doing conferences and things like that. And then COVID hit, and that's not a good time to start that sort of business. And I lived in that gap. I'll be happy when I can do this. And when I stopped living in that gap between sort of where I am and where I want to be, and started building on all the things that I've done and all the things that I've learned over the journey, that gap gets smaller. And if you think about a timeline of where you were 10 years ago to where you really want to be, where are you in a skills and personality wise and all of that sort of stuff. And we live in that gap between where we are and where we want to be. Harvard psychologist Shauna Core calls that putting happiness on the other side of the cognitive horizon. And it's almost like trying to swim to the horizon, the happiness, which is at the horizon. The horizon just keeps moving further away. I want to pay my house off. I want a bigger house. I want a third Ferrari, whatever it is. We always want more. I heard a really good story the other day of a billionaire was getting interviewed, and the interviewer was kind of stirring him a little bit and talking about another billionaire and kind of comparing the two. That guy's got this sort of plane. Is that better than yours? Yeah, no, that one's better than mine. And this billionaire was taking this really well. And you could tell the interviewer was poking the bear. He's got this amount of billion. You've only got this amount of billion. And he was being a bit of a dick. And the billionaire's just taken all this and he's heard all these examples that they put out. And he's gone, but I've got one thing he'll never have. And the interviewer sort of nodded his head slightly to the side and said, oh, and what's that? I have enough. And it was just like, mic drop, back in your box, dickhead. I'm way smarter than you. And it was just awesome. And what that billionaire did, he's obviously a really successful dude. He's a billionaire. But he's not living in the gap. He's building on his gains. And I think that's a really cool thing. And one of the things, and I love hearing these sort of concepts, like Benjamin Hardy and Dan Sullivan had a really cool concept with gap and the gain. And I love getting those and just adding something else, doing a yes and a yes but too. And the yes and I did to that is to close that gap between where we are and where we want to be. I think we've got to have gratitude. If I've got gratitude to all the things that we've been given, gratitude for all the things we've learned, gratitude for some of the difficulties we've had that we've learned to overcome. We've got to have acceptance, and acceptance is huge now. To be able to, here's where I am, and all of these things have led up to here, and here's where I am, but I'm not stuck here. All right, that here's it is what it is, sort of thing. And to have that without apathy, to have that without sort of apathy, that sort of assumption that we can't change. But acceptance without apathy, I think, is really cool. And then purpose. Well, this is what I want to do. This is who I want to be. This is where I want to go. And I think if we have gratitude, acceptance, and purpose, we can kind of narrow that gap between who we are and where we want to be. We're getting all very philosophical now, aren't we?
I like it. No, but it's a big thing. It's a big thing. I hope people really hear that particularly the acceptance without apathy, because in these moments where we are grateful and we do go, yep, well, this is where I am. You do want to make sure that doesn't make people go, I can't go any further. So take notes. That's the bit that, you really want to kind of think on. But Luke, there's a couple questions I really want to ask you as we kind of head toward wrapping up this conversation. But one of them is particularly around that process of looking back. It can inspire us to move forward, but it can also, for a lot of people, leave us with regrets and that realization of, oh, maybe I didn't do that quite as well as I should have, or I didn't do this or that. The name of regret How do you deal with that when you suddenly go, maybe I didn't hit the mark in the ways I would have wanted to?
Yeah, I love The Power of Regret, the Dan Pink book. I don't know if you've read that, but it's a great book. And he interviewed thousands and thousands of people all over the place, and got, what all their regrets were and stuff like that. There's another Australian palliative care nurse called Bonnie Ware that interviewed thousands of people on their deathbeds and asked them about their regrets. And a lot of the ones that they came up with were things like, I wish I was braver, and I wish I put my own happiness first, and I wish I had a done, let myself do the thing that I really wanted to do rather than get pushed around by someone else.
Mm,
And there are a lot of regrets. And I actually think regrets are a really cool thing, so long as we look at them and almost do that Control Alt Delete thing. I can't control this past. What are my alternatives? And what do I need to get rid of? And I think if we can do that with our regrets, we can actually use them as school fees. I
mm,
told the story in the book about, I invented a chair that was like a stool that had a Bosu ball on the top of it. And whole long story, you can read it in the book about, I got a manufacturer in Taiwan who then sold my design to someone else, and balls went flat, and it was a disaster. My furor, my trek into the unknown of office furniture was fairly short-lived. But you could look at that and say, oh, it probably cost me a few $1,000s and all that. And there's regrets about it. I wish I had done a few things differently. But they're also school fees. They're also another way to look at it, is that school fees. And I learned some of that.
mm.
And it entrenched in me that I'm the sort of person that has a crack. And that's kind of cool. I want to be that sort of person that has a crack. The sort of person that doesn't have a crack wouldn't write books, wouldn't do this. So it ingrained that I'm the sort of person that had a crack. I'm really shit at doing stuff like getting dodgy Taiwanese manufacturers to make chairs for me. But that doesn't make me a bad person. So the regrets can pretty easily be turned into school fees if we can reframe them in a way that's actually going to help us.
And maybe that's part of the advice then in this question that you might give to your younger self. Because I wanted to ask you, as someone who, like you say, you're 50 or so, you've accumulated a lot of wisdom in life up to this point. What would you say to your sort of 20, 30-year-old self?
Oh, well, you obviously, the last chapter of the book, we do a thought experiment. And it's a really cool thought experiment. It was given to me by a guy called Cam Schwab, who was a former AFL CEO. And the way you ask the question then is, what advice would you give to your former self? All right. And the way we put it in the book is, what would you thank your former self for? And I'd thank him for having a crack when things were tough. I'd thank him for, looking after his health when his mental health and stuff wasn't good. I thank him for getting
Mm,
off chocolate chip cookies and Pepsi Max and learning how to breathe and get his biology under control. I thank him for all of those things that I've learned. Thank him for some of the stuff ups. All right. And the second part of that experiment was to cast your mind ahead another half a life. So in my case, another 20 odd years. What would 75-year-old Luke come back and thank me for? He'd thank me for getting off the carbs and staying fit and looking after my knees and still being kind to my wife, even if we frustrate each other. He'd thank me for staying curious and looking for different ways. He'd
mm,
thank me for still fighting imposter syndrome and to be able to put your work out into the world even when you are nervous about it,
mm.
and to stay present. My new trademark trait is being present, and I think he'd come back and say, thank you, 2022, Luke, for staying more present, because it's certainly helped.
Mm. I do like the way you look at that, being grateful and thankful to our younger selves, as opposed to thinking they were just some idiot that kind
Well,
of
I
ended up where
was
we are
some
now,
idiot. I was a complete Gumby. I was an idiot. But I learned shit. I worked hard at times. There was stuff
Mm,
that I did between then and now that I'm really proud of. There were some things I mucked up, but again, they're school lessons. They're
yeah,
school fees.
yeah.
But
Well,
that thought experiment's a really cool one.
yeah, and let me ask you this then, Luke. As I ask all of our guests on this podcast, we talk about being undistracted, living around our passions, our purpose, dealing with some of the stuff that gets in the way of that. For you, what do you think it looks like? How would you live an undistracted life?
Oh, dear me. That's almost impossible. Yeah, it's really hard. I actually think I'm not sure that's the right question. I think how would I put little capsules of my life as undistracted? Because I don't think we can do it our whole life. but we can put in little capsules, little time periods where we're undistracted. I found myself, even part of my morning routine is I ride an exercise bike and I read a book in the morning, and I find the movement while reading, I concentrate better. But I kept grabbing my phone for some reason, and I actually ended up putting it in another room. The moment I put it in another room, the distraction went away. So I love that. I love that idea of noise cancelling habits. What's one thing I can do once and it gets rid of a whole bunch of distractions? And things like putting your phone in another room is a really simple noise cancelling habit.
Mm. And
So
like you
I'd
say, you could
probably,
do a whole podcast on the way we use our phones.
we could, and we might just do that. I think that might be a really good podcast. I'd love to come and have another chat to you another time.
Well, Luke, thank you so much for being here now. We really do appreciate your time. And again, encourage everyone to get your book, Curious Habits. Thank you for sharing a little bit about it with us.
Thank you heaps, Laura. It's been emotional.